In this talk, we're going to look at the adaptation of problem-based learning to online learning in response to the restrictions on face-to-face interactions in UK universities as a result of COVID-19. My colleague Sarah is director of a programme in interdisciplinary science that relies heavily on problem-based pedagogy, and my colleague Dylan directs the PBL component of the chemistry programme at the University of Leicester. I'll begin with some general introductions to problem-based pedagogies, and then I'll hand over to my colleagues for further discussion. Here we see a map of the problem-based approach. Many of you will be familiar with this, so I'll outline it only briefly. It begins with a problem or a project. Students working in groups with an academic facilitator or instructor identify the research they need to undertake to begin to tackle the problem. This leads to further discussion and research, both facilitated and independent, with support from lectures or practical exercises until a solution is found and the output created. Problem-based tuition is the name we give to a more strongly scaffolded form of problem-based learning in our interdisciplinary science programme. Here, the learning issues and research activities of the problem are largely pre-planned. We use a module handbook in electronic form with guidance to the reading prior to interactive lectures, which we call our expert sessions. We use suggested questions for group discussion in workshops and individual problems or exercises with feedback in tutorials in order to support group discussion of the module problem. One can think of this as a version of flipped learning with the addition of problem-based architecture. The major issue in taking these problem-based approaches wholly online was the facilitation of the group sessions, as we'll see, not without justification. There was a strong temptation to simplify matters and return to a transmissive mode of delivery through pre-recorded lectures. I'll now turn to Dylan and Sarah, who will take us through the way in which the programmes were adapted, and then I'll sum up at the end.
So this slide gives an overview of some of the adaptations that we've made to our problem-based learning approach. So in the first column, you can see the different types of engagement or the different types of activity that we've done to reach out to our students. In the next column, we can see the general forms that they take. We would be giving students an electronic version of the problem statement. So we do it as e-handout that was uploaded to the virtual learning environment. We would then reinforce that in the first face-to-face meeting. So we'd have a face-to-face meeting to discuss the problem. Now, under the online adapted version of our PBL implementation, we still do the e-handout, of course, but now we host that initial meeting online. So that is now hosted on Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. For the lectures, we used to have an introductory lecture under normal circumstances to give students the opportunity to learn more about the PBL approach, to learn about how they work in teams effectively, why we use this methodology, so framed in terms of the benefits of skills development, of applying subject understanding in novel open-ended contexts. That has now been transferred into a series of online sessions, some of which are live, where we encourage student engagement, where we want students to engage with each other and to engage with us and ask questions. Some of those sessions are also included, also based on recorded material. So where we're just communicating basic information about the process, we might generate some recorded videos as well. The live sessions tend to be somewhere in the region of 40 minutes typically, to give students enough chance to interact with us and to interact with each other. The facilitation sessions themselves, so students are arranged into groups, and we would typically have a number of facilitators who would be members of staff or trained postgraduates available to support those students, and they would typically float between groups, so helping out groups, various different groups during the session. That model has been essentially digitized. Students work in breakout rooms within Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, and the facilitators jump between those breakout rooms. So we still adopt that floating facilitation method, but instead of walking from table to table within a room, we're now moving between breakout rooms in a Blackboard Collaborate Ultra session. The deliverable, we try to keep this as close as what we were previously doing as possible. So where we were previously getting students to do a presentation, we would convert that into an online presentation. So for example, in semester 1, we get our first year students to do a Dragon's Den style pitch of the concept that they've come up with for their PBL problem. That has now moved onto an online platform, so they now live stream their pitch, and the questions they face are pushed to them over from other students via Blackboard Collaborate Ultra. So our sessions were based on 50-minute patterns, and they took place primarily on a weekly basis. So the 50-minute session was broken up into 3 components. You can see there were 2 short staff-led elements. So there would be an opening, and the purpose of that introduction would be to introduce students to the activities that they were meant to go through in that session. Once that introduction was over, the students moved into their breakout rooms, and that discussion was chaired by the students themselves, organised by the students themselves, but those discussions were facilitated. Once we got to the end of that 40-minute period, we brought all the students back together into the main room on Blackboard Collaborate Ultra, and we wrapped the session up.
So, how did we move our problem-based tuition online in response to COVID-19? The problem statement was very similar to before, and that's always been delivered to them in the form of an electronic handbook which they download from the virtual learning environment. So the only difference when we moved online was that rather than having a face-to-face session, this session was delivered online, and students worked in groups to capture their initial thoughts on that problem statement before, as we would do in a face-to-face environment, having a discussion with the rest of the class. If you remember back to our learning cycle for the problem-based tuitions, we have lectures in place to support students to scaffold the concept, and particularly scaffold their pre-session preparation for the discussion workshop. In the online environment, these were moved to recorded introductions. So we lost some of the interactivity there, but it did mean that students had more opportunity to plan the independent study time and to incorporate these around the times that they preferred to do their reading. So I think the biggest change really happened in our workshops, but one of the things that we found certainly early on was that there's a cultural difference between a member of academic staff working as or operating as a floating facilitator, and that's very different in a breakout room. You're either in the breakout room or you're out, and sometimes I think a member of staff entering a breakout room can really feel quite clunky, and certainly resulted, particularly for our first year students, in them feeling somewhat, I think, nervous about interacting and hesitant in their discussion. So one of the things actually that we evolved as part of this is to actually use OneNote, a piece of Microsoft software, which allows several students to essentially input into a document at the same time. One of the key features also was this peer marking, or this certainly group marking of individual submissions. One of the changes we made actually as part of our review prior to going online was actually to make these assessments formative rather than summative. But again, we used a similar format, students working in breakout rooms to discuss the questions and to reach a collective or common understanding, and then we'd discuss those questions later on as a whole class. In terms of the deliverables, it very much depended on the format, but actually for our first deliverable for our first years, we previously asked them to do a group presentation, and so this had to rapidly move online. And I think one of the key things there was it was actually less intimidating environment, and they didn't have to stand up in front of an audience of their peers. There was some I suppose some barrier there, or some safety in being able to sit in their own room and present from a safe space. So I talked about how we'd use this piece of software, OneNote, where people can simultaneously add text. And this is just an example of how we actually utilise that. So what you've got here are some facilitator notes at the start. So this might be some notes that the facilitators entered to support the discussion. You can see the second text here in black is a question that's being posed to the students. You can see their response just there in red, and then the facilitators actually gone in and prompted again. So you can see here a couple of examples of where the facilitator, the member of staff taking the session, has been able to add to the document. So in terms of lessons learnt, I think one of the things that we realised was really key at the start was that we had to support the students in their non-timetabled group work. So one of the things we did there was actually run an additional session where we introduced them to a variety of software which would support them in be able to meet up independently in groups and also work online to produce a single group document. I've talked a lot already about the OneNote, but I thought that was a really positive development in terms of being able to facilitate efficiently, rapidly, but also I think have that oversight of what the whole class is doing simultaneously, which is actually a benefit from what might happen in a face-to-face environment. But one of the things that we found was working in the online environment, scaffolding is even more important than ever, and particularly we focused on making sure the students had a message each week, an update with their weekly schedule for the module, but also really importantly an indication of how long they should be spending on their independent study activities to ensure that they achieve the depth of study where required, but also that we didn't have overly ambitious or anxious students spending too long on a particular task.
I think some of the most interesting things that I've discovered from my observations of working with these students are the way they engage with each other and the way they use the online tools, and B, the way that they work towards the deliverable. They tend to be a lot more creative in terms of the scope of the digital tools that they use within PBL sessions compared to other chemistry sessions that I'm involved with, such as tutorials and lectures. The other big difference between this year and what we do in other academic years is the way students have approached the deliverable. And we saw much more use of digital platforms this year than we ordinarily would do. So we saw a lot more use, a lot more development of video resources, of online games. So they were almost mimicking some of the methodologies that we have been using in our own teaching activities. But 100% of the groups actually chose to do something digital and something that was actually quite creative, which from my perspective was a great experience.
So what is the take-home message? First of all, we found that these problem-based approaches tended towards convergence when we take them wholly online. There's generally greater pre-planning. Contrary to our initial fears, provided we were able to see the students online, that's say so long as they switched their cameras on, we found no loss of educational benefit from the group activities, although of course the students missed the social interactions. But some adaptations were necessary in the format of the facilitation.